Police officers brutally buried a black man, not even realizing that the new sheriff of the county was in front of them. Find out how this terrible mistake changed everything. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories, share this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching it from. The sun was barely cresting the horizon as Jonathan Carter adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of his car. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Today wasn't just any day. It was the day he officially stepped into his role as the newly elected sheriff of Riverbend County. He leaned back in the driver's seat, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. The air inside the car was heavy with the lingering scent of his morning coffee, and the hum of the engine filled the otherwise still morning. The stretch of road ahead was long, framed by flat fields and sparse clusters of trees. Riverbend was a rural county, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, but its problems ran deep. Jonathan knew this all too well. His election had been a shock to many, especially in a county not known for embracing change. He looked at the sheriff's badge lying on the passenger seat beside him. The polished metal caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon of hope. Or maybe a target, he thought grimly. The badge was more than a symbol of authority. It was a promise he had made to himself and to the people who had placed their trust in him. His shoulders felt the weight of it, as though he were already wearing it. Riverbend County had a reputation, one that went back generations. Stories of racial tension, corruption, and abuse of power were woven into its history like threads in a worn tapestry. Jonathan, born and raised in a neighboring town, had grown up hearing those stories. He never thought he'd have the chance to rewrite them. Yet, here he was, the first black sheriff in the county's history, ready to make his mark. The road stretched endlessly before him, cracked asphalt flanked by overgrown ditches and the occasional rusted road sign. The morning light painted the fields in muted tones, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. Jonathan rolled down the window, letting the crisp autumn air fill the car. It was a reminder of why he was doing this, to bring a breath of fresh air to a place suffocating under the weight of its past. As he drove, his thoughts drifted to the people who had warned him against taking the job. Friends, family, even strangers had expressed their doubts. "You're walking into a lion's den," they had said. "You can't fix a system that doesn't want to be fixed." But Jonathan had always been stubborn, and he believed in fighting for what was right, no matter how steep the odds. A flicker of movement in the rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Flashing lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. A patrol car. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He glanced at the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His car was in good condition, freshly washed and polished for the occasion. There was no reason for concern. Yet the sight of those lights triggered an unease he couldn't shake. He slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The patrol car followed, coming to a stop behind him. Jonathan watched as two officers emerged. One was tall and burly, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. The other was younger, leaner, with a sharp gaze that radiated disdain. They approached his car with a casual arrogance that set Jonathan on edge. "License and registration," the older officer barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. Jonathan nodded, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license, along with the registration papers from the glove compartment. "Good morning, officers," he said, his voice calm and measured. The younger officer snorted. "Morning, huh? We'll see about that." The older officer examined the documents, his eyes narrowing. "What brings you out here?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I'm on my way to the sheriff's office. I'm the newly elected sheriff of Riverbend County." For a moment, there was silence. Then the younger officer burst out laughing. "You? Sheriff? That's rich." He turned to his partner. "Did you hear that? He thinks he's the sheriff." The older officer didn't laugh, but his scowl deepened. He leaned closer, his face inches from Jonathan's window. "You think wearing a badge makes you special? Makes you better than us?" Jonathan met his gaze evenly. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, sir. I'm just here to do my job." The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, we'll see about that. Step out of the car." Jonathan's heart sank. He knew what was coming. The warning signs were all there. The tone, the body language, the thinly veiled hostility. He opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stood by the side of the road, the officers flanking him on either side. "Turn around," the older officer ordered. Jonathan complied, his jaw tightening as he felt the officer's hands patting him down. The search was rough, more invasive than necessary, but he said nothing. The younger officer circled the car, peering inside through the windows. "Nice ride," he muttered, "for someone like you." Jonathan bit back a retort. He could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, but he knew better than to let it show. He had spent years mastering the art of restraint, knowing that even the slightest misstep could be used against him. The older officer finished the pat-down and stepped back. "Get back in your car," he said curtly. Jonathan did as he was told, sliding into the driver's seat. He watched as the officers returned to their patrol car, talking quietly to each other. The younger officer glanced back at him, smirking. Then, without another word, they drove off, leaving Jonathan alone on the side of the road. For a moment, he sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The encounter had been brief, but it left him shaken. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. This was just the beginning. He couldn't let it deter him. Adjusting his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. His eyes were hard, his expression resolute. "Not today," he murmured to himself. "Not today." He started the car and pulled back onto the road, the badge on the seat beside him gleaming in the morning light, as if daring him to prove his worth. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays intensifying as they reflected off the cracked asphalt of the desolate highway. Jonathan Carter's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but his mind churned with unease. The encounter with the two officers had left an imprint, like a smudge on the otherwise pristine canvas of his first day as sheriff. He dismissed the thought, determined not to let it derail him. Yet, as the miles stretched out, the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. The silence of the open road was broken once again by the shrill wail of a siren. Jonathan glanced in the rearview mirror, his pulse quickening as he saw the same patrol car speeding up behind him, lights flashing. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pulled over, his tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. This time, the unease wasn't fleeting. It was a full-blown alarm bell in his mind. The patrol car stopped abruptly, and the same two officers stepped out. Their expressions were different now, harder, more menacing. The younger officer swaggered toward the driver's side door, while the older one hung back, scanning the area as though ensuring there were no witnesses. "Out of the car," the younger officer demanded, rapping his knuckles against the window with unnecessary force. Jonathan hesitated, then rolled down the window slightly. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. The younger officer's smirk widened. "Yeah, there's a problem. You didn't use your blinker back there. Step out of the car." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He hadn't passed another vehicle for miles, and the road had been a straight line. The accusation was absurd, but he knew better than to argue. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his movements measured. The older officer approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. He gestured for Jonathan to move to the back of the car. "Hands on the trunk," he ordered. Jonathan complied, the cool metal of the car's surface pressing against his palms. He could feel the younger officer circling him like a predator. The older one began a rough pat-down, his hands lingering longer than necessary. "What's this?" the younger officer asked, leaning into the car and pulling out Jonathan's briefcase from the passenger seat. "That's my work case," Jonathan replied, glancing over his shoulder. "It contains documents for my first day as sheriff." The younger officer snorted. "Sheriff, huh? Still running with that story?" Jonathan straightened slightly, his voice gaining an edge. "It's not a story. I'm the duly elected sheriff of Riverbend County. You'll find my credentials in that case." The older officer chuckled, stepping back. "Credentials don't mean much when you're breaking the law. You know, we've seen plenty of folks like you who think they're above the rules." Jonathan turned to face them, his patience thinning. "What law have I broken?" The younger officer grinned, tossing the briefcase to the ground. It landed with a dull thud, papers scattering. "How about resisting arrest?" he said, his tone mocking. "I haven't resisted anything," Jonathan said, his voice measured but strained. "I've complied with every order you've given me." The older officer crossed his arms, his expression cold. "That's your version. Ours might be different. Who do you think they'll believe?" Jonathan felt a wave of heat rise to his face, his frustration boiling over. He wanted to lash out, to remind them that he was their superior, but he knew it would only escalate the situation. Instead, he forced himself to remain silent, his fists clenching at his sides. "That's what I thought," the younger officer sneered. "Now let's see how well you comply when things get real." Before Jonathan could react, the older officer shoved him forward. He stumbled, but caught himself, turning back to glare at them. The younger officer was already pulling out his phone, pointing it at Jonathan like a weapon. "Smile for the camera," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Let's show the world what happens when someone like you gets out of line." Jonathan stood still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The younger officer stepped closer, the phone inches from Jonathan's face. "Come on, Sheriff," he taunted. "Say something inspiring." The older officer chuckled. "Maybe he's shy, or maybe he's realizing his big title doesn't mean a damn thing out here." Jonathan's silence only seemed to provoke them further. The younger officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "You're not as tough as you think, are you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. Jonathan gritted his teeth, pain shooting through his shoulder. "You're crossing a line," he said evenly, though his voice betrayed a flicker of anger. The older officer stepped forward, his shadow falling over Jonathan. "Out here, we draw the lines," he said, his voice a cold whisper, "and we decide who crosses them." The next few moments were a blur. They shoved Jonathan toward a patch of loose dirt at the side of the road, forcing him to his knees. The younger officer began to dig with his hands, tossing clumps of earth aside. Jonathan's heart pounded as he realized what they were doing. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice firm but laced with urgency. "You're going to regret this." The younger officer laughed. "We'll see about that." They worked quickly, the hole growing deeper with each passing minute. Jonathan struggled against their grip, but they were stronger. When the hole was large enough, they forced him into it, pressing him down into the dirt. His protests were met with laughter and cruel jabs. "You wanted to be sheriff, didn't you?" the older officer said, his face twisted into a sneer. "Now you get to be part of the land you think you're protecting." They covered him with dirt, packing it tightly around his body until only his head remained above the surface. The weight of the earth pressed down on him, restricting his movements. Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. The younger officer crouched down, his face inches from Jonathan's. "Don't go anywhere," he said, his voice mocking. "We'll be back to check on you." The patrol car's engine roared to life, and the sound of their laughter faded into the distance. Jonathan was left alone, the sun beating down on his exposed face. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the distant hum of insects. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing. This wasn't how his first day was supposed to go, but if he survived this, he vowed, it wouldn't end here. The world had shrunk to a narrow band of sky above Jonathan's head. The earth held him in its cold grip, pinning his body in place, leaving only his head free to move. The midday sun was relentless, beating down on his face, blinding him with its glare. The heat was suffocating, but even more so was the crushing weight of the dirt surrounding his chest and legs. He could barely breathe, each shallow gasp only serving to remind him of how trapped he was. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole, and Jonathan had to fight back a wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to stay calm, to control his breathing. He couldn't afford to lose his head now, not when his life depended on it. He had to think, to plan, to find a way out of this. The officers had left him with his head above ground, as if mocking him, taunting him with the illusion of freedom. He could see the sky, the tops of the trees swaying in the breeze, the endless stretch of empty road. But he couldn't move, couldn't fight his way out. He was helpless, and that realization sent a cold shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on something other than the heat and the weight pressing down on him. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the stories his father used to tell him. His father had been a quiet, dignified man, a man who had faced his share of struggles, but never let them break him. Jonathan remembered the nights they sat together on the porch, his father's deep voice weaving stories of hope and resilience. "Sometimes, son, life will bury you," his father had said once, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But it's up to you to decide whether you're going to let it keep you down or fight your way back up." Jonathan could hear those words now, as clearly as if his father were standing beside him. He could see his father's face lined with age and wisdom, and he could feel the strength in those words. His father had faced a world that tried to break him, and he had refused to bow. Jonathan had inherited that strength, that refusal to give up. He opened his eyes, blinking against the sunlight. He could see the horizon, the distant outline of trees and hills. He was still alive, still breathing, and as long as he could breathe, he could fight. He tried to shift his body, to find some give in the earth that surrounded him, but the dirt was packed too tightly. He could barely move his arms, and his legs were pinned beneath layers of soil. Time stretched on, the hours blending together. The sun moved across the sky, its rays slowly fading as evening approached. The heat began to lessen, replaced by a chill that seeped into his bones. His muscles ached from the strain, his skin itched from the dirt, and the constant pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. He could feel his energy waning, but he refused to give in. A sound broke the silence, the distant rumble of an engine. Jonathan strained to turn his head, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew louder, closer, and then he saw it. The headlights of a truck approaching from the distance. He tried to call out, his voice hoarse and weak from hours of dehydration and exhaustion. "Help!" he croaked, barely able to raise his voice above a whisper. He forced himself to try again, pushing every ounce of energy he had left into that one word. "Help!" The truck slowed as it approached, the headlights washing over the patch of ground where Jonathan was buried. He saw the truck come to a stop, and then the door opened, and a figure stepped out. Jonathan's heart surged with hope, and he struggled to keep his eyes open as the figure approached. It was an older man, dressed in worn jeans and a plaid shirt, his face lined with age and sun. He stopped a few feet from Jonathan, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the sight before him. "Lord, have mercy," the man muttered, dropping to his knees beside Jonathan. "What in the world happened to you, son?" Jonathan swallowed, his throat dry and raw. "Police. They did this," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. The man shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. What kind of man would do something like this? He didn't wait for an answer. He stood up, rushing back to his truck. Jonathan heard the sound of metal clattering, and then the man returned with a shovel. "Hang on, son. I'm gonna get you out of there," the man said, his voice filled with determination. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Jonathan could feel the vibrations of the shovel as the man dug into the earth, each scoop of dirt removing a small portion of the weight pressing down on him. The old man worked quickly, his face set in a grim expression. As the dirt was removed, Jonathan began to feel the first flickers of relief, the ability to expand his chest, the sensation of air finally filling his lungs more fully. Finally, the last of the dirt was cleared, and the man grabbed Jonathan's arms, helping him sit up. Jonathan winced as the blood rushed back into his limbs, the pain almost unbearable. But he gritted his teeth and forced himself to move. He had to get out of here, to get away from this place. The old man helped him to his feet, his arm steadying Jonathan as he swayed on shaky legs. "Can you walk?" the man asked, his voice filled with concern. Jonathan nodded, though his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "Yeah, I think so," he said, his voice still hoarse. "Thank you. You saved my life." The old man gave him a grim smile. "No thanks needed. Just glad I found you in time." He paused, glancing back toward the road. "You need to get somewhere safe. You got anyone you can call?" Jonathan thought of the sheriff's office, the place he was supposed to be starting his first day. He thought of the men who had done this to him, men who were supposed to be his colleagues. He felt a surge of anger, a fire igniting inside him. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. "I'll be okay," Jonathan said, his voice gaining strength. He straightened, his gaze hardening. "I've got some business to take care of." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "You do what you gotta do, son. Just be careful. Not everyone in this county wants to see change." Jonathan met his gaze, his expression determined. "That's exactly why I have to do this." The old man helped him to his truck, and Jonathan climbed inside, wincing as his sore muscles protested. The man handed him a bottle of water, and Jonathan drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. He knew what he had to do. He had to get to the sheriff's office, had to confront the men who had tried to bury him. He wasn't just going to let this go. He had a responsibility, to himself, to the people who had elected him, to the memory of his father who had taught him never to back down. As the truck rumbled to life and began moving down the road, Jonathan opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The road ahead was long, and he knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had come too far to turn back now. He was alive. He was breathing. And as long as he could breathe, he would fight. Jonathan's body ached with every step as he walked up the stone steps leading to the Riverbend County Sheriff's Office. The old man had dropped him off a few blocks away to avoid any attention. He had offered to help Jonathan in any way he could, but Jonathan insisted that this was something he had to do on his own. He had a promise to keep. A promise to those who had elected him and a promise to himself, to ensure that justice was more than just an empty word in this place. The sheriff's office was housed in a nondescript two-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling in places, and the windows were smudged with years of grime. It wasn't a grand building, but it was a symbol of law and order, and Jonathan had every intention of making it stand for something real. He opened the door, the creaking hinge echoing through the empty hallway. The worn linoleum floor seemed to absorb his footsteps as he walked through, every movement a reminder of the soreness that still lingered in his muscles. He was tired, he was angry, but most importantly, he was ready. As he walked in, a few heads turned his way. There were officers and clerks moving around, tending to their daily duties, most of them unaware of the storm that had swept over their new sheriff. Deputy Arlen, a tall, lean man with sharp eyes and a stern demeanor, was the first to approach him. Arlen had been one of the few to welcome Jonathan warmly when he had won the election, and his face now was one of both surprise and concern. "Sheriff Carter," Arlen began, eyeing Jonathan's disheveled appearance, "you look like hell. What happened?" Jonathan gave a tight smile, his eyes scanning the room. He could see the curiosity in the eyes of his staff, some of whom were trying to pretend they weren't watching. "Had a bit of trouble on the way in," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Nothing that can't be dealt with." Arlen frowned, his gaze narrowing. He seemed to know better than to press for details in public. Instead, he gestured toward the back office. "Why don't we talk in private, Sheriff? You need a moment to collect yourself." Jonathan nodded and followed Arlen down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They entered the sheriff's private office, his office now. The room was sparsely furnished, with an old wooden desk, a pair of filing cabinets, and a few dusty plaques hanging on the walls. There was a hint of stale cigarette smoke lingering in the air, a relic of the previous administration. Arlen closed the door behind them, his eyes filled with concern as he turned to face Jonathan. "All right, Sheriff, spill it. You look like you've been through hell. What happened out there?" Jonathan paused, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. He could still feel the weight of the dirt pressing down on his chest, the laughter of the officers echoing in his mind. He wanted to tell Arlen everything, to unload the horror and the fear that had consumed him. But he couldn't. Not yet. "It's not something I can talk about right now," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I need you to trust me." There's a lot going on in this county, and I'm going to need all the support I can get to make things right." Arlen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You've got it, Sheriff. Just say the word, and I'm with you." Jonathan allowed himself a small smile, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Thanks, Arlen. I appreciate it." Arlen returned the smile, though there was still a hint of worry in his eyes. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. But you should know, not everyone here is going to be on your side. Some folks aren't too happy about the changes coming." Jonathan nodded, his expression hardening. "I'm well aware of that. But that's why I'm here, to change things, whether they like it or not." There was a knock on the door, and a young clerk peeked in, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Jonathan. "Sheriff, there's someone here to see you, says it's important." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Arlen, then turned back to the clerk. "Who is it?" "It's Deputy Matthews and Deputy Colson," she said, her voice hesitant. "They said they wanted to formally welcome you." Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Matthews and Colson, the same officers who had buried him in the dirt like he was nothing. They had the nerve to walk into his office to pretend like nothing had happened. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not when he was so close. "Send them in," he said, his voice cold. The clerk nodded, her eyes wide as she disappeared down the hallway. Jonathan turned back to Arlen, his expression grim. "You'd better stay for this." Arlen frowned but nodded, positioning himself by the door. Jonathan moved behind the desk, his eyes fixed on the door as it opened and the two officers walked in. They wore matching smirks, their postures relaxed, as if they owned the place. "Sheriff Carter," Matthews said, his voice dripping with false friendliness, "we thought we'd come by and welcome you properly. You know, make sure you're settling in all right." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, but he forced a smile, his expression hard. "That's very considerate of you, deputies." Colson shrugged, glancing around the room with a look of disdain. "Not much of an office, is it? But I suppose it suits you." Jonathan could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he kept his face neutral, his eyes cold. "You know, I've been thinking about making some changes around here, starting with the personnel." Matthews raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Oh? And what kind of changes are we talking about, Sheriff?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering. "The kind of changes that make sure the people working in this office understand what justice really means. The kind of changes that get rid of corruption and abuse of power." The smirks on the deputies' faces faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Colson shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. "Is that so?" Jonathan stood up, his eyes blazing with determination. He took a step closer to the two deputies, his voice low and deadly serious. "You two think you can intimidate me. You think what you did out there on the road is going to scare me off. But I've got news for you. You messed with the wrong man." Matthews and Colson exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. Matthews took a step forward, his voice filled with barely contained rage. "You think you're tough because you wear that badge? You think you can come in here and change the way things work?" Jonathan didn't back down, his gaze unwavering. "I don't think I'm tough. I know I'm right. And I know that no matter how much you try to intimidate me, I'm not going anywhere. This is my county now, and I'm going to make damn sure it's a place where people like you don't get to abuse their power." Colson sneered, his hand twitching as if he wanted to reach for his weapon. Arlen cleared his throat, stepping forward. "I think it's time you two left," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The sheriff's got work to do, and he doesn't need any distractions." For a moment, it looked like Matthews might argue, but then he seemed to think better of it. He turned on his heel, his face twisted in a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Carter," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this." Jonathan watched as they left, the door slamming shut behind them. He took a deep breath, his hands still clenched at his sides. Arlen walked over to him, his expression a mix of concern and respect. "You're playing with fire, Sheriff," Arlen said quietly. "Those two aren't going to back down easily." Jonathan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the door. "I know, but I can't let them think they've won. I have to show them that things are going to be different now." Arlen sighed, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But just be careful. This county's got a lot of dark corners, and not everyone's going to be happy about the light you're trying to shine." Jonathan looked at Arlen, his expression resolute. "I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to make things right. And I'm not going to stop until that happens." Arlen gave him a nod, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Well then, let's get to work." Jonathan watched as Arlen left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. He sank into his chair, his body aching from the strain of the day. But despite the pain, despite the fear and the uncertainty, he felt something else, something stronger. Determination. He had come to Riverbend County to bring change, to bring justice. And he wasn't going to let anyone, not Matthews, not Colson, not anyone, stand in his way. He reached for the stack of files on his desk, the files on the deputies, on the complaints that had been filed against them, on the corruption that had been allowed to fester for far too long. He opened the first file, his eyes scanning the words, his mind already working on a plan. This was only the beginning. The night outside was black, with only a faint glimmer of starlight piercing through the clouds. Jonathan sat in the dimly lit sheriff's office, the only light coming from a desk lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. The reports and documents before him had long since blurred into an indecipherable mess. He rubbed his tired eyes, his body still aching from the ordeal of being buried alive, but his mind was sharp with purpose. He had spent the last few days carefully gathering information. Everything he could find on Deputies Matthews and Colson he had collected and documented. There were whispers of their corruption everywhere. Complaints that had been buried, misconduct reports that had disappeared. Jonathan knew that confronting them directly wasn't just about justice for what they did to him. It was about ending a culture of abuse that had gone on for far too long. He was ready. It was time to confront them, and he had a plan. The radio on his desk crackled, drawing his attention. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. "Units 12 and 15, we have a report of a disturbance on Route 6 near the old barn. Possible altercation requesting immediate assistance." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Route 6, one of the more remote areas of the county. He knew that Matthews and Colson were patrolling that sector tonight. It was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. He stood, grabbing his jacket and holster, and made his way out of the office, his boots echoing down the empty hallway. The night air was cool as he stepped outside, the weight of his badge and gun belt grounding him. He slid into his patrol car, the engine growling to life as he pulled out of the parking lot. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove, his thoughts focused on what lay ahead. As he approached Route 6, the beams of his headlights illuminated the familiar sight of an old barn, its silhouette stark against the night sky. There, parked on the gravel shoulder, were Matthews and Colson's patrol car and another beat-up vehicle, a rusty old pickup. Jonathan's stomach tightened as he pulled up behind them, his headlights washing over the scene. He could see them now, Matthews and Colson standing by the pickup, their postures aggressive, their voices raised as they yelled at the driver, who stood beside his car with his hands raised. It was a young black man, his face pale under the harsh glare of their flashlights. Jonathan's jaw clenched as he watched Matthews shove the young man against the side of the truck, Colson standing by, his hand resting on his weapon. Jonathan turned off his headlights, stepping out of his vehicle, the cool night air filling his lungs. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the two deputies. They hadn't noticed him yet, too engrossed in their display of power. He could hear Matthew's voice, dripping with venom as he spat insults at the young man. "You think you can just drive through our county without any respect?" Matthews sneered, pushing the young man again. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" The young man shook his head, his voice trembling. I didn't do anything. I was just driving home, sir." Colson laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Driving home, huh? You sure you're not hiding something in that truck of yours?" "That's enough." Jonathan's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. Both deputies froze, turning to look at him. Matthew's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening as he recognized Jonathan. "Sheriff Carter," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't expect to see you out here tonight." Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze locked on Matthews. "Clearly. But here I am." Colson took a step forward, his hand still resting on his weapon. "This is none of your concern, Sheriff. We've got it handled." Jonathan's eyes flicked to Colson's hand, then back to his face. "I think it became my concern the moment you decided to abuse your authority. Step away from the man." Matthew's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us how to do our job?" Jonathan didn't back down, his voice steady. "I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you to stop breaking the law." Colson's face twisted with rage, his hand inching closer to his weapon. Jonathan's own hand moved to his side, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with the possibility of violence. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Jonathan spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Matthews, Colson. Step away from the vehicle now. This is your last warning." The two deputies exchanged a glance, the challenge clear in their eyes. Matthews' smirk faltered for a moment, uncertainty flashing across his face. Colson's hand froze, his gaze shifting between Jonathan and the young man they had pinned against the truck. The silence stretched on, and then slowly Colson lowered his hand, stepping back. Matthews hesitated, his eyes narrowing at Jonathan, but after a moment he too stepped away, his face twisted in barely concealed fury. Jonathan kept his eyes on them, his heart pounding as he walked over to the young man. "You're free to go," he said softly, his voice reassuring. "I'm sorry for what happened here tonight. It won't happen again." The young man looked at Jonathan, his eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. He nodded, quickly climbing back into his truck and driving away, the sound of the engine fading into the night. Jonathan turned back to Matthews and Colson, his expression hard. "This is over," he said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "You're both suspended, effective immediately. There will be an internal investigation, and I will personally ensure that justice is served." Matthews took a step forward, his face twisted with rage. "You can't do this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jonathan held his ground, his eyes cold and unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I know exactly what kind of men you are. You've had your power for too long, and you've abused it. That ends tonight." Coulson sneered, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think you're some kind of hero, Carter? You think anyone's going to back you when this all comes down?" Jonathan met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "I don't need to be a hero. I just need to do what's right." The silence between them was thick, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Matthews and Coulson exchanged a glance, their faces hard, their hatred for Jonathan clear. "This isn't over," Matthews said, his voice a low growl. "You'll regret this." Jonathan watched as they turned and walked back to their patrol car, the door slamming shut behind them. He stood there, watching them drive away, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. He took a deep breath, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his body. His hands still shook slightly, the tension of the confrontation taking its toll. But he had done it. He had stood his ground. He had protected an innocent man, and he had taken a stand against the corruption that had festered in Riverbend County for far too long. Jonathan walked back to his own patrol car, sliding into the driver's seat. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, his mind racing with the events of the night. He knew this was only the beginning. Matthews and Coulson weren't going to back down easily. They were going to fight, and they were going to use everything they had to try to bring him down. But Jonathan was ready for them. He had faced death, he had faced his own fear, and he had come out the other side stronger. He knew the road ahead was going to be long, and it was going to be dangerous. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. He started the engine, the rumble of the car filling the quiet night. He drove slowly, the road winding through the darkened fields and forests of Riverbend County. As he drove, he thought of the young man he had saved, of the fear in his eyes and the gratitude that had replaced it. That was why he was here. That was why he had taken this job, why he had run for sheriff in a county that didn't want him. It was for people like that young man, for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves, who had been silenced for too long. Jonathan's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw set in determination. This was his county now, and he was going to fight for it with everything he had, no matter what. The dawn was just beginning to break, streaks of orange and pink painting the horizon as Jonathan Carter pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's office. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on him, but so did a sense of clarity, a determination that what he had started needed to continue, no matter the consequences. Matthews and Coulson were now suspended, but the fight was far from over. Jonathan parked the patrol car and took a moment to collect himself. The worn brick building of the sheriff's office stood before him, a symbol of everything he needed to change. Today was a new day, and Jonathan was resolved to make it the beginning of a new order in Riverbend County. As he entered the office, the usual early morning buzz greeted him. Dispatchers on the radio, deputies chatting, and the scent of brewing coffee wafting through the air. Heads turned as Jonathan made his way toward his office, murmurs following him. He could feel the tension, the curious stares of those who had heard about what happened the night before. Deputy Arlen was waiting for him outside his office, his face lined with worry. Jonathan gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was ready for what came next. He opened the door and stepped inside, Arlen following closely behind. "Morning, Sheriff," Arlen said, his voice carefully neutral. "I heard about last night." Jonathan took off his hat and set it on the desk, looking up at Arlen. "It needed to be done," he said simply. He paused, studying Arlen's face. "But I know it's not over. I'm going to need your help, Arlen. If we're going to clean up this department, I need people I can trust." Arlen nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Jonathan's. "You know you can count on me, Sheriff. But you're right. Matthews and Colson aren't going to go quietly. They've got friends, and they're not the only ones with dirty hands in this department." Jonathan sighed, leaning back against the desk. He knew Arlen was right. He had already seen the files, complaints that had been buried, evidence that had disappeared. Corruption had taken root here, and it wasn't going to be easy to uproot it. "I'm not asking for easy," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "I'm asking for what's right. We're going to do this by the book. We're going to make sure that the people of this county know they can trust the law again." Arlen gave a faint smile, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "All right, Sheriff. Just know it's going to get rough. Not everyone here's going to be on board." Jonathan nodded. "I expect nothing less." He paused, his gaze shifting to the window where the sun was beginning to rise over the county. "I called the state investigators. They'll be coming in to conduct a full inquiry into the department. Every complaint, every piece of misconduct, it's all going to come to light." Arlen's eyebrows shot up, a hint of surprise crossing his face. "The state? That's a bold move, Sheriff. It's going to ruffle a lot of feathers." Jonathan smiled grimly. "Good. It's time this place had a shake-up." There was a knock at the door, and Deputy Mitchell, a young officer who had just joined the department a few months before, peeked inside. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between Jonathan and Arlen. "Sheriff, there's a reporter from the local paper here. They want a statement." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Arlen before nodding. "Send them in, Mitchell." The young deputy nodded, disappearing back down the hallway. Arlen gave Jonathan a long look. "You sure about this, Sheriff? Talking to the press right now could be risky." Jonathan nodded, his expression unwavering. "The people need to know what's happening. They need to know that things are changing, and that we're not afraid to face the truth." A moment later, the reporter stepped into the office. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a determined look about her. She carried a notebook and a voice recorder, and she approached Jonathan with a nod of greeting. "Sheriff Carter, I'm Lisa Hernandez from the Riverbend Gazette. I was hoping to get a comment on the suspension of Deputies Matthews and Colson." Jonathan gestured for her to take a seat. "Of course, Miss Hernandez. I think the people of Riverbend deserve to know what's going on." Lisa gave a small smile, her pen poised above her notebook. "Well, Sheriff, I think everyone's wondering what led to their suspension. There are rumors, but nothing concrete." Jonathan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Last night, I witnessed Deputies Matthews and Colson engaging in behavior that was not only inappropriate, but a violation of the law. They abused their authority, and I couldn't stand by and allow that to continue. They've been suspended pending a full investigation by the state." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, her pen moving quickly across the page. "An investigation by the state? That's a big step, Sheriff. What do you hope to achieve with this?" "I want accountability," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I ran for this office because I believed that the people of this county deserved better. They deserve a sheriff's department that they can trust, one that protects and serves every member of this community, not just a select few. Bringing in the state is the only way to ensure that this investigation is thorough and impartial." Lisa nodded, her eyes glinting with interest. "There are those who say that Riverbend has always been a place where the rules bend for certain people, especially those in power. Are you saying you intend to change that?" Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I'm saying that the days of corruption and abuse in this department are over. I know it won't be easy. I know there will be resistance. But I made a promise when I took this badge, and I intend to keep it. We're going to make things right, no matter how hard it gets." Lisa smiled, her pen pausing for a moment. "That's a bold promise, Sheriff. I hope the people of Riverbend are ready for it." Jonathan nodded. "I hope so too. But whether they are or not, it's happening. We can't afford to keep looking the other way." Lisa stood, extending her hand. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff. I'll make sure the people hear your side of the story." Jonathan shook her hand, watching as she left the office. He turned to Arlen, who gave him an approving nod. "You're making waves, Sheriff, big ones." Jonathan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. It's time this county had a wake-up call." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and tense conversations. Jonathan knew that the suspension of Matthews and Colson had sent shockwaves through the department. He could see it in the eyes of his deputies, the fear, the uncertainty, the resentment. Some of them had been friends with Matthews and Colson, and now they were questioning whether they were next. Others were simply scared, unsure of what this new sheriff meant for their future. By late afternoon, Jonathan found himself alone in his office once again, the sun dipping low on the horizon. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He knew he had started something that couldn't be undone, and he was prepared to see it through. But he also knew the road ahead was going to be fraught with danger. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. He looked up to see Deputy Mitchell standing there, his face pale. "Sheriff, there's something you need to see. It's about Matthews and Colson." Jonathan's heart sank, but he stood, nodding for Mitchell to continue. Mitchell led him down the hallway and out to the parking lot. There, parked in the shadows, was a battered old pickup. Spray-painted in large, angry letters across the side of Jonathan's patrol car were the words, "You'll pay for this." Jonathan stared at the message, his jaw clenching. It wasn't unexpected, but it was still a reminder of just how much was at stake. Mitchell looked at him, his expression anxious. "What do you want to do, Sheriff?" Jonathan turned to Mitchell, his expression resolute. "We keep moving forward, Deputy. We don't back down." Mitchell nodded, though the worry was still etched on his face. "Yes, sir." Jonathan watched as Mitchell walked away, then turned back to the graffiti. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. This was his fight now, a fight against fear, against hatred, against everything that had been allowed to fester in this county for too long. He wasn't naive. He knew there would be more threats, more attempts to scare him off. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to back down. The people of Riverbend needed a sheriff who would stand up for them, who wouldn't be swayed by threats or corruption. Jonathan reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the car. He thought of the young man he had saved, of the look in his eyes when Jonathan had stood up for him. That was why he was doing this. That was why he had taken this job, why he had faced death and fear and refused to bow. The sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness settling in around him. Jonathan looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to appear. He knew the road ahead was going to be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had allies, people like Arlen, like the young man he had saved, like Lisa Hernandez, and he had the strength of his own conviction. This was his county now, and he was going to fight for it, no matter what it took. He turned away from the car, his shoulders squared, his steps sure as he walked back into the sheriff's office. A new order was coming to Riverbend County, and Jonathan Carter was going to make sure of it, one battle at a time. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Leave a comment about what touched you the most and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to also check out our other stories. Each one carries an important message. Your support keeps us going.